So Sue and I welcome all of you again. Thank you. And stay tuned with us after the author's talk so we can sort of talk about maybe our book suggestions for next year. So please stick around and give us some input after our author talk this evening. A little introduction for our author, Howard Blum. He is an American author and journalist, formerly a reporter for the Village Voice and the New York Times, a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, and the author of several nonfiction books, including the one that we're going to talk about tonight, The Night of the Assassins. So Howard, welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for inviting me.
My first question, what actually inspired you to write about this attempted assassination of these three wonderful gentlemen, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill?
When I set out to write a book, I like to find something that I can learn. I mean, one of the great things about being an author is that you're paid money to actually spend several years learning something new. And I had never heard of this. I just read a small item in the papers about it. And I thought, well, is this possible? Is this true? How come I don't know about it? So I spent the next 3 years going to archives around the world. And what I dug up was, well, nothing less than a true life Day of the Jackal. And I thought, well, this can be cool, but can I actually make it work? And also when I write a book, I try to make them read as narratives. I try to create characters. I try to get as many details as I can so that it...
3, 5, 2, 9, 6, 4, 4.
Hello?
I don't know what that was, but maybe it's a UFO book. But as I was saying, I try to make them read novelistic, that there's a narrative drive to the story, but they also have to be true stories. As you had mentioned, I started out as a New York Times reporter, so I adhere to the New York Times standards of veracity. If something's in quotes, it was actually said. So I need to find a subject where there are memoirs or letters or contemporary news reports so I can get inside the heads of my characters. And fortunately, so many of the people in this story, Mike Riley, Schellenberg, even Squarzini, they all had memoirs. So all these elements came together that it convinced me that I could tell a true and exciting story that people hadn't known about before.
I like the way you actually brought us into the story immediately. Those first few pages, you're delving us right into what's coming up next, which I thought was really great. I know you've introduced us to a lot of wonderful characters. Can you talk about first Mike Riley, and you feel that was he up to the task of being FDR's bodyguard?
Well, Mike Riley is, first thing you have to think about, he was 33 years old when he got the job of being in charge of FDR's security detail. He gets promoted ahead of many more experienced agents. The promotion comes just a day after Pearl Harbor, and Mike gets the job because FDR likes having him around. He's a very affable guy. He grew up in a small silver mining town in Montana, was a college football star out west. But now he has this awesome responsibility. He's a good time guy. And he has this awesome responsibility of protecting a war crime commander-in-chief. Even more than that, this president has, well, it's a unique security problem. He is literally paralyzed from the waist down. He can't take a single step. He will be a sitting target. And further compounding all of this is Mike's relationship with the president. When Mike was 9 years old, his alcoholic father ran off to Montana. He never saw him again. And in FDR, Mike has found the father figure that he always wanted. And his commitment to the boss, that's what he always called FDR, his commitment to the boss's safety was not just one of professional responsibility, but was one of deep personal affection. So that, this is a large burden on Mike's very broad shoulders. And then he's told he has to go to Tehran to check out this city. And those naive days, there was no real advance squad. There's just Mike Riley, this 33-year-old kid. And the first thing he does when he leaves the Oval Office and getting this assignment, he has to go to a map. He has no idea where Tehran is. So Mike is coming in at sort of a disadvantage, and he has to rise up to the occasion of the most extreme, intense circumstances.
FDR, what are some of the highlights or some of the points when you were doing your research that kind of stuck out to you about FDR?
Well, what struck me the most about FDR was his courage. I mean, here this man is, paralyzed from the waist down. We talk about Jill Biden going to, the Ukraine. This, it was, I guess, a couple of days ago. Well, here's FDR in the middle of wartime, traveling halfway across the war while the Nazis are striking all through Europe, and he decides to go there because that's the one place where Stalin will meet. Originally, FDR wanted to meet in Alaska, and Stalin wouldn't do it. Why did Stalin want to meet in Tehran? Well, for two reasons. One, he didn't like to fly, he was scared. And second, the Russians had 20,000 troops there, he thought he'd be safe. So FDR has to acquiesce to him because it's so important to get the Russian support so we can win this war and then make a viable peace. And for him to have the personal courage to do this, he has to sneak off. No one knows about this meeting. It's supposed to be top secret. And he goes off on a destroyer to Europe. And as the destroyer is going on its way across the Atlantic, there's a artillery exhibition between the other ships, and a torpedo by accident. They shoot a live torpedo and almost sinks FDR's boat before he gets even to North Africa. So he was taking really large risks, and I admired him greatly for what he was willing to do for the world and its nation.
Great. I know you've introduced us to some other really great characters. Can you talk about Otto and Walter and Rudolph and give us some of the highs and the lows of those three wonderful characters that you introduced us to?
Sure. Otto Squarzini is, Germany's greatest commando. He's, you think of your Aryan Superman, that's Squarzini, right down to the dueling scar in his cheek. He's totally ruthless, totally committed, but he's a very versatile commando. He was given the mission by Hitler to rescue Mussolini, who was in a mountaintop prison, and there was seemingly no way to get up there. There was only a single cable car. It was guarded by a brigade of Italian troops. You couldn't land a plane on the mountaintop because of the winds. You couldn't parachute down because of the winds. So Squarzini decides we'll go in by gliders. And the German Air Force High Command says, well, you'll probably be blown off the mountaintop. And Squarzini is still committed to do it, and he does. And he accomplishes this mission. So he sort of makes him the perfect head of the Operation Long Jump, the plot to kill the big three. You also asked about Walter Schellenberg. Walter Schellenberg is a Nazi SS general. He's 33 years old, youngest general in the German army, same age, coincidentally, as Mike Riley. And he's in charge of the SS's Section 6. That's their foreign intelligence service. But Schellenberg is not your typical SS thug. He's not an ardent Hitlerite. He's not a true Nazi believer. He's more of a pragmatist. He joined the SS just after he graduated law school because he thought that would be his chance to a bountiful future. But now this gilded future that he imagined for himself is in grave jeopardy because it looks very clear that the Nazis are going to lose the war. And when they lose the war, people like Schellenberg will have to appear before war crime tribunals. And he's afraid that he'll be hung by his neck. So he throws himself into trying to come up with this plan for the assassination of the big three. And he goes about it in a very methodical, lawyerly way, figuring out when can we strike, when would be the best time, how can we make this work? And he pretty much comes up with a plan, which is struck me most of all, that the Nazi assassins come nail-bitingly close to succeeding. I mean, that was the most amazing thing I discovered. Those were the two other main characters in the book.
Do you, in your studies and writing the book, how difficult was it to keep Tehran a secret? And I know you mentioned Alaska was a possibility for meeting. Tehran was the one they actually settled on. Were there other possibilities in the mix for where they might have met had it not been Tehran?
Yes, I mean, FDR and Churchill they did not want to go all the way to the Middle East. No, there was a war going on, it was dangerous, they had responsibilities. FDR suggests first they'll put a ship in the North Atlantic and they'll be able to protect it with a cordon of destroyers, and Stalin vetoes that. Then they come up with, perhaps Churchill suggests, sort of quixotically, we'll make 3 tents in the desert, and he makes a biblical reference to it in the letter to Stalin, and Stalin doesn't even deign to answer that. The only place that Stalin will agree to is Tehran. And is it secret? Well, it was fairly well kept secret, except for a German spy. And he was the valet to the British ambassador in Turkey, and I think in Ankara, Turkey. And he was a sort of a comic figure. He was short and he wore strange uniforms that the ambassador dressed him up in, sort of out of Arabian Nights. But each night when the ambassador would go to bed, he would put his keys to his top secret safe where he kept his top secret documents on his nightstand. So this valet decides that he can take the keys, open it up, and read the cables. And he approaches the Germans and says, I'll get you whatever's inside that safe, but I want 20,000 British pounds, which is a fortune back then. And the Nazis, well, they don't know whether or not this is actually Schellenberg's decision. He doesn't know whether or not to believe this guy. But then he comes up with a good solution. He'll get the German counterfeiters to counterfeit 20,000 pounds. So if he gives them the money, no big deal. So they give him the money, and then they look at the documents, and then as Schellenberg writes, the documents spoke so eloquently that the spy will be forever forth known as Cicero, after the German orator. And these documents reveal the plan for the meeting of the Big Three in the last week of November in Tehran. And so while it was kept secret for most of the world, the Nazis had a head start in knowing.
Wow. So as you were writing, were there any surprises or any shocking parts of the story that you couldn't include in the book, or were there moments in the book where you did find surprises or shocks that you'd like to talk about, either or both?
Well, interestingly, there's a small mention in the book of a guy from the U.S. Army Motor Pool working on trucks during the day, and at night he played in a band that would entertain the troops and also nightclubs in Tehran. His name was Robert Merrick. According to a reference in the British archives that I found, an interview with him, he was used as a spy, and he also had a relationship with an Iranian woman, Lily Sanjari, who was living with one of the Nazi collaborators. So she was, in effect, having a relationship with the Nazi and this American, and he was exploiting her, getting information to give to the OSS. I never could find enough to flesh it out. However, I don't know if you've ever seen the TV program Homeland, that series. Those two guys, Alec Ganza and Howard Borden, are making a series based on Night of the Assassins. And for a while, they were thinking about making Mike Riley, the lead figure to get you through this. But now it's this man I have a small reference to, Robert Merrick, this spy who was in the motor pool, who was playing in a band and having an affair with a woman who's also having an affair with the Nazi, who is a central figure. So I would have liked to have looked into that more, and I've done a little more for the series, but it's really hard to get all the details.
Very good. So what's in store for you now as far as a new book goes? Anything in the mix?
Not only in the mix, but heading to the stores as we speak. On June 7th, my next book comes out, next nonfiction book from HarperCollins, The Spy Who Knew Too Much. And it just got a rave early review, I'll say immodestly, in Publishers Weekly. It said it reads like a Le Carré novel come to life. I happen to have memorized that quote. And what the story is about, on a bright autumn morning in 1978 on the Chesapeake Bay, a sailboat runs aground. The Coast Guard goes to investigate, and they find bullets scattered around the deck. They go below, and they see top secret documents there, stamped top secret. There's no sign of anyone. They see electronic equipment, which is very strange, which is later identified as a burst transmitter. That's for communicating with satellites. But there's no sign of the owner, who turns out to be John Paisley, a high-ranking CIA official. 10 days later, a body floats to the surface, wrapped in 36 pounds of chains, yet it manages to float to the surface. And this may or may not be John Paisley. He's been eaten by the Chesapeake Bay crabs. The CIA says even though he worked there for 25 years, for some reason they've lost his fingerprints. So it's a bit of a mystery. Meanwhile, a spy who retired from the agency after he was investigated for being a mole and then exonerated, Pete Begley, is now retired, and he decides that this incident will have the solution to all that's gone wrong at the agency over the past 10 years, all the blown operations, and perhaps he can find out who really is the mole and salvage his own tarnished reputation. And from that setup, The Spy Who Knew Too Much begins, which you can buy now on Amazon and get it delivered to your house on June 7th.
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
We have a question from the group here. You did a masterful job of incorporating earlier events into the narrative without losing the thread of the story. Could you please talk about your research and writing process, please?
Sure. And thank you for the compliment, whoever said it. I try to identify characters who are going to guide us through the story. As you pointed out, Mike Riley, Schellenberg, Squarzini. And then I want to find a way, these are the point of views that who are going to tell the story, almost like a camera in a movie. And then once I've established this point of view, I got to figure where's the opening scene? What's the good way to begin? And I read about this incident in Churchill's memoirs about how the Nazis tried to shoot down his plane and they thought they succeeded for a while. And that seemed to set the tone of this battle of assassins and the ruthlessness of the Nazis. I mean, and of the justification for political assassination. I mean, we had Lindsey Graham 2 weeks ago talking about that the US should kill Putin. So, I mean, the validity of political assassination seems to be back. We've been doing, drone strikes on ISIS. Trump famously took out an ISIS leader that way. And I wanted to get this feel of legitimacy or illegitimacy of political assassinations to sort of start my book. And the Churchill incident, which he talks about in some detail, allowed me to do it from his point of view and to get what was going through his mind in the aftermath of of that incident.
I've asked you a lot of questions of what I was interested in. Is there anything that you now would like to talk about that I haven't brought up? Any part of the book that you might want to discuss a little further?
Well, one aspect which isn't really part of the book, but this book was written during COVID, and part of it was still research during the beginnings of COVID. And I've done this. When my new book comes out in June, that'll be my 15th book. I've been doing this for a while, and I've been a reporter for a while, and people ask you, is your job dangerous? And I said, well, the only danger is, missing deadlines. But this book was actually dangerous. I had to go take interviews before there were vaccines. I remember going down to Washington, D.C., the Beltway, to speak to someone in the intelligence business in a conference room where there are no windows. He refused to put on a mask, and I thought, I'm never getting out of here alive. That filled me with fear. So, and also, your book, when reading about World War II and doing research, I'm talking to you now from my house up here in Connecticut. It's a very bucolic spot. I've got old stone walls and a pond, and really on top of a hilltop, sort of cut off from the world. And it's hard, a challenge for me to imagine what it's like living in World War II, where you have to make decisions about how you protect yourself, how you protect your family, what you will do. You're living under a constant threat of danger. Well, I sort of had that also during COVID. I think we all did. It was a very uncertain, unsettling time. And I say we had it. I'm not sure we're out of it yet. But that was one of the unique challenges about writing Night of the Assassins.
Anything else in the book you'd like to talk about now that we have you and you're captivating us?
Again, sort of this education of turning it into a series. It's one of the good things about being as a writer, you learn things. Well, I'm learning something completely new. I'm dealing with very smart guys. Gonza and Gordon were roommates in Princeton 20 years ago. The director, Jonathan Mostow, is a Harvard grad. And the idea that I can be working to try to create something that's based on something I did, get all these smart people excited about it, is really fun. I'm involved in writing the script too, which are new challenges, a different type of narrative approach, and I'm trying to see if I can rise to the occasion intellectually.
Yeah, do we have any questions in the chat? And anyone have any questions that you want to ask? If you want to send us up a post-it, Sue will collect them. Do you have any questions?
Let's look over here. So if anyone wants to click the raise my hand at the bottom of the screen, I'll be able to see it.
Any questions?
Yeah, another thing to talk about is also Tehran. I mean, Tehran is a Middle Eastern city where all this takes place, with sandy streets and a grand bazaar, and the locals are in the cafes, smoking hookahs and playing with their worry beads. But it's also a city of 1 million people. I mean, it's a large place, and it was also an occupied city. There were 20,000 Russian troops in and around Tehran. They ruled the city. Their soldiers were on street corners with their weapons. Their tanks rumbled past the camels on the boulevards. And it was also a city full of intrigues. There was a very active fifth column of pro-German supporters. And perhaps also interestingly, it was a racist country, Tehran. The Shah was an ardent supporter of Hitler, and he enacted racial laws that were modeled after the Nazis' pernicious Nuremberg edicts. And in fact, the Shah went so far as to change the country's name from Persia. Why? Because Iran means Aryan. So here a large contingent of African American soldiers, more than 3,000 of them, went to Iran, the Tehran area, and they found themselves in a very racist country.
Do you write in longhand first or on the computer, and how many drafts do you work through?
Well, what I try to do is I make notes and outlines with my pen, and then I start writing on the computer. I start early, and I spend the whole day writing and writing and rewriting constantly. But at the end, by the time I finished a chapter, when I'm ready to say this chapter is done, I sort of put it aside till the book is, there are 40 chapters, whatever it is, and then I reread them all again and make some changes. Then the editor will come in. Fortunately, with the Night of the Assassins, there wasn't much editing involved by the editors, which is either they're lazy or they like what they read. I'm not quite sure. And that was good. But I spend a large part of each day writing and rewriting, and that makes writing on the computer just such a joy that you can constantly keep on changing and still have the sense that you're actually creating a page that can be printed.
The question is, when was the torpedo first reported?
The
Incident. The torpedo incident first reported.
When FDR was on his way to the conference, he was going across the North Atlantic, and there was this being a demonstration of naval firepower for him. And one of the ship's captains put in a live torpedo rather than a dummy torpedo, and he targeted FDR's boat, and it just missed literally by yards. It was first reported not long after the Tehran conference. A paper in Virginia, like a naval town, like either Norfolk or one of those, broke it, and it became fairly well known. It was acknowledged by the Navy. The captain of the ship was demoted. It was quite a scandal. According to people who witnessed it, FDR was fascinated by how close the torpedo came, and the deck actually shook, and the Joint Chiefs were literally with him on the deck. I mean, they could have taken out the whole U.S. High Command by our own forces before they even got to North Africa.
Any other questions from our guests here in the depot? Anyone else? How about online, Sarah? We got anyone else?
Right, we'll be able to see the chat, and we'll also be able to see if you click the raise hand button, if anyone is on Zoom who wants to participate.
We're looking in the chat, Howard, to see if there's any questions on our Zoomer people.
It's so quiet.
No. Forget. Okay. Forever hold your peace. Any questions? Okay. Howard, anything else you would like to add?
I'm just
here we
looking
go.
for questions here.
Here we got one. We seem to be as sophisticated security-wise as the Brits and the Russians. Is that so?
Well, back then, talking about security-wise, we might have been a little bit more sophisticated than the British. Churchill's plan is to sneak into Tehran. This is a top secret conference. He gets there, and there's the British ambassador with a band, and lying the whole way to the British embassy, the 3 miles, there are these Iranian soldiers mounted on horses in comic opera uniforms. And they're like pointing the way for any kind of sniper. And Churchill later would say, if a demonstration had been meant to put me in the most possible danger, it could not have been more shrewdly planned. He's being sarcastic, but he was scared stiff. He kept on feeling, he said, that he was in the assassin's crosshairs the entire way. The U.S., though, when FDR came in, he came in at 3 o'clock that afternoon. They took him directly to the U.S. Embassy without any concern. At one point, the decision is made to move FDR from the U.S. Embassy to the Russian Embassy because it'd be safer there. It's in a compound in the center of town near the British, and they won't have to travel each day. And this time, when FDR is being moved, Mike Riley comes up with the idea of putting an agent in the presidential limousine, and this agent is the sitting duck, as he describes it, and he's taken to the embassy while FDR is in the back of Mike Riley's Jeep, and they're racing on the back roads to get there.
What is the most challenging aspect of your work on these books?
Well, there's sort of two challenges, and that I've referenced before. One is they have to be true stories. You have to get all these facts. And then the second thing, once you get the facts, and because it's history, you can't always get all the facts you want. How do you present it in a readable way? And then when you're missing something, it's not obvious. How do you sort of fold the flaps together so it doesn't seem like you're missing something important? How do you segue between the events? How do you create a sustained, character-driven narrative and at the same time being faithful to the facts? And that's sort of the dual challenge that I have to engage in each one of these books. And each one of these books brings its own unique challenges because of the stories. And sometimes your sources are very unreliable narrators. People aggrandize themselves, people give different versions of the events, and you have to figure out whom you believe, because you don't want to say, on the one hand, source A says this, but source B says that, and then have a bunch of footnotes. What I'm trying to do is not write a scholarly text for academics, but write a book that I can talk about at the Lexington Historical Society.
You have gained deep insight into Stalin's character through this book. Is Putin a clone, and how is he different?
Well, I'm no authority on Stalin, or Putin for that matter. I think Stalin was a more agreeable guy, oddly enough, but at the same time, he was totally ruthless. And I don't know what Putin's end game is, and I don't know how he's going to get out of the situation he's in, and that's what scares me. I think Putin is capable of doing some very catastrophic things rather than losing. At the same time, Stalin was able to marshal this Russian people. I mean, 50 million Russians were killed in the course of the war. I mean, it's incredible. And they kept on fighting. And now Putin is about to, if it looks like he's going to lose this war, I think he's capable of doing anything. And that's what I find scary.
What was Stalin's risky moment getting to or when in Tehran?
Well, for Stalin, probably one risky moment was getting on the plane. He was scared stiff of flying. He just did not like to fly. But Stalin also came to Tehran on sort of a secret mission. Even though the US was Russia's allies during the war, Stalin had sent his spies into America. And his spies had discovered the existence of the Manhattan Project, our program to build the atom bomb. And he went to the conference wondering, will FDR confide to his ally the existence of this super weapon? And his advisors were telling him, if FDR doesn't tell you about this weapon, it can only mean one thing. once this war is over, the Americans will think very long and hard about using the super weapon against the Red Menace. And so he carried that with him while he was meeting with FDR. And he also, if you read the transcripts of the meetings, he goes out of his way to taunt Churchill. And at one point, Stalin gives a speech saying that once this war is over, he's going to have to exterminate 20,000 Nazis. And FDR says, well, maybe not 20,000, only 10,000. And Churchill is so enraged by this comment that he storms out of the dinner. He goes next door and he's sitting there in the dark, brooding, and he feels a hand on his shoulder. And he turns around and it's Stalin trying to convince him that he was only kidding. But I wonder if Stalin really was kidding. So in that way, maybe he's like Putin.
What became of Mike and the other main characters after the war?
Well, Mike, after the war, after FDR's death, I mean, he was there the day FDR died in Hot Springs. His last really act as head of the detail was to take FDR's breakfast that he had that day to the lab to be analyzed to see if there was any poison in it. You just have to be sure. And he quit the Secret Service really not long after that. And after FDR's death and the war was over, he went to work for Boeing. Boeing was the airplane company that had designed FDR's special plane, and Mike had advised on that, so they hired him. And he worked there for a number of years. He also managed to get married 4 times to various people who, some of them said he was a great husband, others complained about him, but he did have four wives, and he also, there were some reports, if you look in the Boeing personnel records, which I did, of his drinking a bit too much. As for Schellenberg, he did wind up before a war crime tribunal. He wasn't hung, he was sentenced to 10 years. He served the 10 years, and then he died very shortly after his release of stomach cancer. Squarzini was taken before a war crimes tribunal for during the Battle of the Bulge. He had dressed up his soldiers in American uniforms to infiltrate the American lines, and this was considered a war crime. But then the British testified that they had also dressed up their soldiers as Germans, so he was cleared, and then he became sort of had a varied career. At one point, he was being looked into for being a war criminal by Israel. There were other reports by the Israeli press that they hired him to hunt down renegade Nazis. He lived in Spain for a while, had a horse farm in Ireland, so he had a very full life.
Are there any sidebars or any little side stories that you couldn't put in the book that you wished you had time to get in there?
Well, I try to put the whole kit and caboodle in there. What I would like to have done maybe a bit more is the story of the Russians who originally found the 38 parachutists who the Nazis who came in, and how they actually caught them, how they interrogated them, and how 6 managed to escape and remain on the loose. Those are sort of the mysteries of history that I hope we'll love to see the records finally opened and all revealed. Another incident that also that struck me as odd is when FDR comes back, he gives his first, I think it's December 14th, 1943, he gives his first press conference in the Oval Office. And he starts talking about the Tehran conference. And at one point, he says, we had a bit of a security problem. And you can sort of hear the room hush. And then he said, it would have been a pretty good haul if they could have gotten all 3 of us. and then he breaks into laughter. And the amazing thing to me is that the press joins him in laughing, and then there are no follow-up questions, which is, you couldn't imagine that happening today, that the press would be so complacent. But again, that was a wartime press, rather.
So one more question, I think, unless Sarah has any more in the chat or anyone else has any out there. When are the records or documents available to researchers? You say you have read Mike's records, for instance.
Well, Mike's records are in the FDR library in Hyde Park, New York. For Mike, you can find a lot of interesting things. There's a file on him. There's these little handwritten notes he made of the place settings at the various dinners where he wanted everyone seated. They also have the menus from the dinner, and some of the terms on the menu are in French. You can see Mike writing question marks. He doesn't understand the French. So there's also a photograph in the FDR library that I reproduced in my book of Churchill's birthday party when the attempt was going to occur. And Schellenberg had been right. You can see there are the big three, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, sitting shoulder to shoulder. There's the birthday cake in front of them. And at that moment, as they were singing, happy birthday, Winston, if the plan had succeeded, the Nazi assassins would have crashed in to deliver Hitler's birthday present. And all that information is in the FDR library in Hyde Park, New York, which is a wonderful library.
And there would have been more than birthday candles to blow out.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, anything else from anyone? Well, Howard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I hope your new book is a success, and I hope we can talk with you again.
I hope you'll like the book. I hope you'll read it and like it, and then I'd be glad to come back. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.